Youngstown, Ohio, is a city built on the American dream and the cooling embers of the steel industry, and the rattling of the freight trains. In the late 80s, the unforgiving skyline was a jagged iron horizon, a place where the deeply entrenched myth of the self-made man was more than a slogan. It was a religion. Here, your worth was measured by the height of the empire you could raise from the dust of the Rust Belt. Frank Dolan and Ray Kowalski were the priests of this faith. Childhood friends who had survived the playgrounds of the neighborhood in the lean years of their youth, they formed a partnership in 1987 that felt like destiny. Ray was more than a business partner. He was the godfather to Frank's son, Thomas, a man who stood at the baptismal font and promised to protect the boy as his own. They were two sides of a coin, building a construction firm that became the pride of their community, a symbol of local boys making good in a forgotten town. But while the buildings they raised were solid, the foundation of their partnership was being eroded by a darkness that Frank kept hidden behind a polished smile. For 11 years, Frank masterminded a deception so intricate it became his primary occupation. It didn't start with $1 million heist. It began with a single diverted contract. A small percentage skimmed to cover a personal debt Frank was too proud to mention. He called it business strategy privately, a temporary loan from the future. But the thrill of the easy gain was a narcotic. Soon, the strategy evolved into a machine of falsified invoices and ghost accounts. Every Friday, Frank sat across from Ray at their favorite local diner, sharing stories about their families and the growth of the company, all while Ray's portion of the profits was being siphoned away into Frank's secret reservoirs. Frank justified the betrayal by convincing himself that his intellectual labor, the navigating of the ledgers, was worth more than Ray's sweat on the job site. He convinced himself that as long as the empire looked grand from the outside, the rot in the core didn't matter. The collapse arrived not with a bang, but with the scratching of a pen on a Tuesday morning in 1998. It was a routine bank audit, the kind of mundane event that happens 1,000 times a day across the country. But for Frank, it was the moment the world stopped turning. A junior auditor noticed a discrepancy in equipment leases that didn't exist, and within hours, a decade of carefully curated lies unraveled like a cheap suit. The final tally was a staggering $4 million, and it wasn't just a financial loss. It was the total theft of Ray's life work and a decade of history. The public reckoning was swift. The local newspapers that once heralded their success now painted Frank as a pariah, a man who had fed on his best friend's trust to fuel his own vanity. In the courtroom, the air felt thick with the smell of old wood and the cold reality of the law. Frank stood at the defense table, his haunted eyes fixed on the floor as the plea deal was read. He would trade years of his life for a debt he could never fully repay. But the most cutting moment wasn't the judge's sentencing. It was the visual of Ray Kowalski's back. As the session ended, Ray didn't offer a word of anger. He didn't look for an apology. He simply stood up and walked toward the heavy oak doors, his shoulders square, and his silence deafening. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We are part of the American Heartbeat community, exploring the true cost of the choices we make. We often focus on how much a man builds, but we rarely examine how he builds it. As Frank watched Ray disappear, he realized legal fallout was easy. The real sentence would be served in the silence of his own home. He was about to move from the third person of a public scandal to the first person of a private tragedy, where the numbers mattered less than the look in his son's eyes. The judge's gavel hadn't just ended my career. It sounded the start of a marathon I wasn't prepared to run. $1,400,000. When you see a number like that on a legal document, it ceases to be currency and becomes a physical weight, a granite slab strapped to your chest. My sentence wasn't just about a cell. It was the 15-year repayment order that truly defined my new reality. Every dollar I earned for the next decade and a half belonged to the ghost of the man I had betrayed. I was no longer Frank Dolan, the successful contractor. I was a living debt collection vehicle. The courtroom shame was a sharp pain, but the realization of the long road was a persistent ache. The most brutal moment happened at my kitchen table 3 weeks after the plea deal. The house was quieter than it had ever been. My son Thomas, who was only 12, sat across from me. We were eating leftovers in a kitchen that suddenly felt too large. Thomas had always looked at me with hero worship. But that night his eyes were searching, clouded with a confusion that no child should carry. He pushed a piece of cold chicken around his plate, his fork scraping against the ceramic with a sound that set my teeth on edge. "Dad?" he whispered. I looked up, trying to force a smile. "Yeah, Tommy?" He didn't look up. He took a shaky breath, and the question he'd been holding back finally broke through. "The kids at school, they're saying things. They're saying you took money. Dad, did you really steal from Uncle Ray?" The air left the room. My first instinct, the one that had sustained my deception for 11 years, was to craft a narrative. I wanted to protect his image of me, to keep that hero worship alive. But as I looked at his small hands trembling against the table, the words died in my throat. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, frozen. The longer I stayed silent, the more the answer became clear. I watched the realization dawn on his face, a slow transformation from hope to a devastating clarity. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a confession. It was the definitive admission that everything he believed was a lie. Without a word, Thomas pushed his chair back. He didn't cry. He just walked out, leaving his dinner and the shattered remains of our relationship on that table. In that moment, I realized I had lost everything that wasn't monetary. Youngstown is a town with a long memory. Social death followed. I went from the man who sponsored Little League teams to the one people crossed the street to avoid. My marriage buckled under the public shame. I lost the company, the house, and my place in the world. I moved into a cramped apartment where the walls were thin and memories thick. The next 7 years were a blur of grueling labor. I worked as a laborer, hauling cement on sites where I used to be the boss. Every paycheck reminded me of my debt. I lived on pennies, funneling everything toward that $1, $4 million mountain. It was the slow, rhythmic grind of manual labor and the crushing absolute isolation of my own choices. I was paying back the money, but the debt to Ray felt like it was growing rather than shrinking with every passing year. The financial restitution was a simple matter of math, but the moral restitution was a matter of the soul. After 7 years of this penance, something inside me shifted. The silence between us was more painful than the physical work. I knew Ray had moved to the quiet Pittsburgh suburbs to escape our past. I didn't want his forgiveness, but I needed to face him. I sat in my truck, looking at a map. I couldn't hide in the shadows of my labor forever. It was finally time to go. The 2-hour drive from Youngstown to the Pittsburgh suburbs became my weekly ritual of penance. For 6 consecutive Saturdays, I parked my high-mileage truck at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, watching the man I had betrayed from a cowardly distance. I watched Ray through the dusty windshield, seeing him mowing his lawn and dragging out heavy trash bins in the gray morning fog. I was a ghost haunting the edges of a life I once shared. The weather shifted from the spring chill to the humid weight of a late summer, mirroring the stagnant air inside my cab. Each long trip back to my lonely apartment felt like a fresh failure, a cowardice that tasted like cold coffee. On the 7th Saturday, the cycle finally broke. I pulled directly into his driveway. The engine ticked in the silence as I stepped onto the scorching asphalt. Before I could even reach the porch, the door swung open. Ray stood there in a faded blue bathrobe, holding a steaming ceramic mug. He looked older, his face etched with a profound exhaustion that wasn't anger, but weary resignation. We stared at each other for a long minute across a canyon of 11 years of lies. He didn't yell or demand the remaining restitution. He simply stepped back, left the heavy oak door standing wide open, and walked inside. That open door was the greatest act of grace I had ever received. It wasn't an invitation to be brothers again, but an acknowledgement that the truth was finally standing in the light. We sat at his small kitchen table and spoke for hours about the business, the money, and the wreckage. I realized then that forgiveness is a gift the victim gives to themselves, but accountability is the lifelong burden for the perpetrator. We are not best friends now. The scar tissue is too thick to ever return to the innocence of our youth. But we coexist. I am no longer a ghost haunting his driveway, and he is no longer the judge sitting in the center of my nightmares. I have learned that you don't simply get over a betrayal of that magnitude, you just learn how to walk with the permanent limp it leaves on your soul. Today, my life looks nothing like the empire I once tried to build on a foundation of sand. I live in Cleveland now, and my office is often behind the reinforced glass of a correctional facility. I work with a prison entrepreneurship program, sitting across from men like Marcus, whose restless ambition reminds me painfully of my younger self. I don't teach Marcus about profit margins or quarterly growth. I teach him that a man's true worth is measured by the integrity of his foundation, not the height of his skyscraper. I offer him my own story as a blueprint for a man who chose to be rebuilt from the rubble of his own vanity. Every Sunday evening, my phone rings with a call from my adult son, Thomas. Our conversations are still careful, occasionally shadowed by the lingering memory of that night at the kitchen table, but he calls. We talk about the weather, his work, and the slow, steady process of being a human being. He no longer looks at me with hero worship, and that is the greatest relief I have ever known. He looks at me as a man who fell and had the courage to admit he was broken. The myth of the self-made man is a dangerous lie we tell to justify our greed. None of us are truly self-made. We are made by the trust of our friends, the love of our families, and the grace of those we've wronged. If you have ever had to face the wreckage of your own choices and start over, I want you to comment the word rebuilt below. It is a hard road, but it is the only one that truly leads home. May your foundations be strong and may your legacy be written in truth rather than gold. God bless you, and God bless the slow, holy work of restoration.